And now we continue on with Roman numeral 5, talking about Asian Americans. Now again, like some of the other sections, there's going to be a little bit of a recap here since we've talked about all of this before, but hey, we're going to go over it again. Now, with Asian Americans, they were actually invited into the country in the mid-1800s, mid to late 1800s, in order to work on the railroads because we needed their expertise with explosives because we had to put holes in the mountains, and also because they worked cheap and their lives were expendable. Again, racist, but it's what it was. We basically said that, if they blew themselves up, we didn't care because, there were more where that came from. And besides, again, you could hire them for a lot cheaper. So we encouraged more and more Asian Americans to move to the United States in order to work on the railroads, in order to connect the eastern part of the country to the western part of the country. That was the plan. Unfortunately, so many of them answered the call and came to the U.S. that the people out in California and so forth panicked and basically became concerned they were going to be overwhelmed by Asian Americans. They were going to take all their jobs and shag all their women, etc. And so as a result, we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was to ban Asian immigration. But because, again, we couldn't figure out there was differences between Japanese and Chinese and Korean and Vietnamese, etc. We just said, Chinese, they're all Chinese. That's what it is. But the loophole, of course, was that you could come over if you had a family. And so remember, this accidentally sparked the rise of mail-order brides because Chinese women, or Chinese families rather, would sell their daughters into a white person's family over in the United States, which meant they could all come over. So it didn't really actually stop immigration. It just changed which groups came. The other major sort of agreement here is the Gentleman's Agreement. The Gentleman's Agreement was between us and the Emperor of Japan in the 1800s because the Japanese were also really concerned about us. The Japanese were very insular people at this point in time, were basically worried that white people were going to come over to Japan and corrupt them, among other things. So the agreement of the Gentleman's Agreement basically is that the Japanese would stop their people from leaving the country to come to the U.S. as long as the U.S. did not come over to Japan either. It was basically you stay on your side of the line and we stay on ours. These were the two main agreements that governed immigration between the U.S. and Asia up until the early 1900s. There was a lot of discrimination against Asian Americans in the West in the early 1900s for a number of reasons, basically being that it was easy. Again, there's no gentle way to put this. Asian people look different than white people, and so as a result, it was really easy to discriminate against them. Because this was the pattern. You remember we talked about how up in New England you blamed the Irish and you blamed the Italians for taking your jobs? Well, in California and that area, you blamed the Asians. And Irish and Italian people could at least blend in. The Asian people could not. And so as a result, the Asian community largely pulled into itself. This is why you had those things like Chinatown start to form. They formed their own neighborhoods as a way of self-preservation. The idea being that by living by themselves and working by themselves, they could avoid the discrimination, the violence, the economic problems that other groups faced. And this worked, within reason, up until World War II. Again, hopefully I'm not telling you something you don't already know, but in World War II we fought against two major countries, and Italy, but no one counts them. We fought against Germany and Japan primarily. You had Germany, Hitler, and you had Japan with Tojo and everything. This, of course, sparks up nationalism in the country, we got to beat those nasty Nazis and so forth. But again, Germans can blend in because, again, now there's no delicate way to put this, Germans look white, they're Caucasian, they're Western European. There's no distinguishing markings. Although, if you look at the art and propaganda of the 1940s, there are some horribly racist caricatures of German people. But again, at first glance, not that difficult. However, the Japanese were much more obviously distinguished. And so as a result, there was a lot of racism towards Asian Americans, particularly out west. We viewed that all Asians were potential spies. We referred to them as the fifth column. The fifth column being the term where we applied to Japanese people who are in the U.S., or Asian people, I should clarify, Asian people living in the U.S. who were just waiting for orders from Japan to come and take us out. That was the general opinion, that you had all these Asian people living out in California who were going to, again, destroy us. They were just waiting for orders from home. If you want fun, go find the book Dr. Seuss Goes to War. I'm pretty sure Miss Clark has it. And you can find several of the cartoons Dr. Seuss made when he was an editorial cartoonist, and they are some racist stuff. But again, in the 1940s, that's what was acceptable. Finally, the government, bowing to pressure, forced Asian Americans into camps. Now, before you ask, no, not like the Germans and the Jews. That's a different type of camp. The Germans and the Jews did, did labor camps and death camps where they worked Jews to death or then just executed the Jews because that took, working them to death took too long. The U.S. put them in what we would call internment camps. The idea is that we made little communities for Asian people where they could live and where they could work and they could be by themselves and they could not leave. So this is one of those moments of history where it's really hard to explain the logic. But the logic was that we didn't want Asian people mixed in with the rest of American community because we weren't sure we could trust them. But we weren't cruel like the Germans, so let's make it like, again, a nice little community. Each of these internment camps had, again, employment, they had doctors, they had dentists, and I swear to God this is true, even had cheerleading squads, okay? Again, we want you to live your life normally. And so, the teenage girls, just as you could join the cheerleading squad at school, you could join your internment camp's cheerleading squad. Jesus. Again, it's one of those things that I'm sure made perfect sense at the time, but wow, in retrospect. If you ever had to read Farewell to Manzanar in 6th grade, I think it is, this is what we're talking about, that whole area. I want to say you might have also had to read something, you read something about this possibly in 7th or 8th grade as well. But again, the internment camps. Now, you might think that this is horribly unconstitutional and racist, and again, you'd be right. But someone filed a lawsuit about this. A gentleman by the name of Fred Korematsu filed a lawsuit against the government pointing out the obvious, which is you can't do this. This is racist, and this is unconstitutional. It's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Didn't we learn anything from Cherokee v. Georgia? What the Supreme Court says in the case of Korematsu v. U.S. basically is, yeah, but it's a war. Really, that's the logic. The logic in Korematsu v. U.S. is, under normal circumstances, the government taking away your rights would be horribly unconstitutional. But in case of a war, all bets are off. What they're basically arguing is that in times of war, certain constitutional protections can be suspended for the good of everyone. Which is also sort of the argument that gets used oftentimes with terrorism and so forth nowadays, the idea being that we can spy on terrorists or we can, use enhanced interrogation techniques on terrorists because, again, they're terrorists. Desperate times call for desperate measures. And that's what Korematsu v. U.S. said, is that, again, desperate times call for desperate measures. The U.S. government has since apologized for this. In the late 90s, Fred Korematsu was actually given the Presidential Medal of Honor for his filing of the lawsuit and arguing out for the rights of Asian Americans. Again, we have since long, apologized, saying, this is not something we should have done. It's one of those things that sort of taints FDR's legacy. That's right, Will, FDR. But in any case, so again, not something that we're particularly proud of, but it did happen, so, we can't ignore it. But all we can do is really learn from the past. Under modern issues, this is where it gets sort of entertaining, is that the Asian American community, statistically speaking, does a lot better than the other minority communities, economically, educationally, and so forth. They tend to be economically more advantageous than academically. They graduate at much higher rates than other minority groups, which makes sort of an unusual situation in that Asian Americans are much more likely to oppose matters like affirmative action. Whereas Hispanic Americans and African Americans and Native Americans oftentimes support affirmative action and endorse it, in the Asian American community, affirmative action is oftentimes viewed very with a very negative view, because the logic being that they worked so hard by themselves, they don't want affirmative action and so forth. And also because, remember, again, economically, the more you have, the less likely you are to support redistributive policies. In this case, affirmative action they view as redistributive. And so again, as a result, politically speaking, it makes for sort of odd bedfellows. The Asian American community tends to vote with the Democrats on social issues, but the Republicans on economic issues. And so, for example, with things like, say, abortion or religion or gay marriage, the Asian American community tends to be more liberal. But economic issues, things like taxation, welfare, and so forth, they tend to stick more to the Republican side, which means as a result, they're not really counted on in any of the groups. The other reason why politically Asian Americans don't really have a huge impact is there are very few states where they are a massive force in terms of number. California, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington State, these are the only states where Asian Americans make up a huge, significant voting chunk. And even then, not enough that they get essentially pandered to. In fact, it wasn't until the 90s that those states even actually elected an Asian American, congressman, which is far behind like Hispanic American, Native American, or African American in terms of representation. And so that's sort of the current modern issue for Asian Americans, is that while they are economically and academically more productive and more successful than other groups, politically they are not viewed as a very powerful force, which again is sort of catch-22. They have success in some areas, but not success in others, which it gets to be sort of a frustrating element for them. That pretty much takes care of Roman numeral 5, is that? 4? 5? 5. That was 5 Asian Americans. So now we instead move on into Roman numeral 6, women. And that will be our next video. Roman numeral 6 coming up next.